If you grew up in Britain after the war, the chances are you built an Airfix kit, newspaper spread on the kitchen table, fingers glued together, a Spitfire hung from the bedroom ceiling on a length of cotton thread. At its peak, Airfix held 3/4 of the British market and turned out 20 million kits a year. The brand had become the very word for a plastic kit. It had survived the war that interned its founder, survived the rationing that starved it of materials, survived the death of the man who built it, and outlasted every rival to become a national institution 2 generations deep. It had come through all of it, and none of that is what brought it down. What did was a single mistake, made inside those walls, at the very height of its success. What was it, and how did it bring down a name that had become an English word? Chapter 1. The Hungarian Who Hated the Idea. The story begins, as the best ones often do, with a man who got almost everything wrong on the way to getting one thing spectacularly right. London, 1939. War was coming, and into a city bracing for the blackout came a restless, aging émigré named Nicholas Kove. He had been born Miklos Klein in 1891, in a village called Anarx in the far east of the Kingdom of Hungary, a Hungarian Jew who had already lived 3 or 4 lives before he ever set foot in England. He had run a plastics factory in Barcelona. He had fled the Spanish Civil War to Milan in 1936, where he patented a process for stiffening shirt collars and gave it a name he was rather pleased with, Interfix. Then, in the last weeks before everything closed down, he had packed up again and crossed to London. He liked words that ended in fix. He had decided his next company would begin with the letter A, so that it would sit at the very top of any trade directory a buyer might thumb through, and his first product was a range of air-filled rubber toys. So he took the air, and he took the fix, and he put them together. Airfix. The name had nothing whatsoever to do with aeroplanes. That would come later by accident, like almost everything else. Kove was not, by most honest accounts, a natural businessman. He was a grafter, an improviser, a man who had spent his whole life one step ahead of catastrophe, and when the war came, catastrophe caught up. He was interned for a time on the Isle of Man, as so many émigrés were, suspected of being the very thing he had fled. When he came back, the raw materials he needed had all but vanished into the war economy, and for years he scrabbled and bartered and begged simply to keep the doors open. What he kept open was a small plastics business, and in 1947, Kove did something that would matter far more than he could have known. He bought the first injection moulding machine in Britain. He used it to make combs, plastic combs, by the million. Within a couple of years, Airfix was the largest comb manufacturer in the country, and, for a while, the largest supplier of die-stamped metal belt buckles to the War Office besides. This is the unlikely soil from which one of the most beloved names in British childhood would grow. Not aircraft, not heroism. Combs and buckles, made by a Hungarian refugee who wanted his company listed first in the directory. Then, in 1949, a tractor changed everything, though Kove would spend years insisting it hadn't. A man called Harry Ferguson, the great agricultural engineer, came to Airfix wanting a model, a small promotional replica of his Ferguson TE20 tractor, the little grey Fergie that was transforming British farming, something his salesman could carry into a farmyard and set on a kitchen table. Airfix moulded the parts. The factory's women workers assembled each one by hand before it went out, and the assembled tractors kept breaking. They came back fiddly, fragile, falling to bits in transit. So somebody at Airfix had a thought that was less an act of genius than an act of exhaustion. Stop assembling them. Sell the tractor as a bag of loose parts and let the customer do the building. Let someone else have the headache. It was the birth of the construction kit, and the man who would one day run the company, Ralph Ehrman, remembered it exactly like that. Not as a masterstroke, but as a way of making the problem somebody else's. Kove did not believe in it. When the idea of a proper kit business was first put to him, he was scornful. There was no money in it, he thought. Children would never have the patience. At one point, when his own designers pushed the concept, he is said to have threatened to charge them personally for the cost of the tooling if it failed. He was wrong. He was about to be more wrong than he had ever been in his life, and he would not live to see quite how wrong. Chapter 2. 2. Bob and a bag of parts. The decision that built the empire came not from inside Airfix at all, but from a buyer's desk at Woolworths. In the early 1950s, a Woolworths buyer named Jim Russon made a suggestion. There was an appetite, he thought, for a model of Sir Francis Drake's ship, the Golden Hind, the kind of thing then sold in America as a ship sealed inside a bottle. Why not make it in polystyrene, the newer, harder plastic, and sell it cheap? Very cheap. Woolworths had a price point it would not move from, the price of true pocket money. 2 shillings. 2 bob. That single constraint forced the invention that made Airfix what it became. You could not sell a model in a printed cardboard box for 2 shillings. The box alone cost too much. So Airfix threw the box away. They sealed the parts in a clear polythene bag, stapled a folded paper header across the top with the instructions printed on it, and hung it on a shop hook. The whole thing for the price of a comic and a sherbet. It worked beyond anyone's hopes. A model that a child could buy with their own money, hang back on the rack, and beg their mother for the following week. Airfix had stumbled into the perfect product for a Briton just climbing out of rationing, where a little plastic ship was a luxury a working family could actually afford. And then, in the mid-1950s, came the aeroplane. The first Airfix aircraft kit was a Supermarine Spitfire, moulded to a scale of 1 to 72, small enough to be cheap, large enough to feel real in a child's hand. It was, by the standards of what came later, a bit of a disaster. Modelers nicknamed it the BTK. It had been scaled up rather crudely from an American kit, and it was riddled with inaccuracies that the more knowing builders, many of them former RAF men who had flown the real thing, spotted at once. The complaints came in by the post bag. But here is the thing about that flawed little Spitfire. It sold and sold and sold. Because it was not really a model of an aeroplane. It was a model of a memory. The war was barely a decade gone. The fathers building these kits at the kitchen table had lived through the Battle of Britain as young men. The sons building them were growing up in its long shadow. To glue together a Spitfire in 1955 was to hold, in miniature, the most powerful symbol of national survival that Britain possessed. Airfix understood what it had, only slowly. When the accuracy complaints kept arriving, they did the sensible thing. They hired one of their own critics. A modeler named John Edwards came in as chief designer, and for around 15 years he set the standard for Airfix kit design, raising it from rough approximation to something the purists could respect. He drove that work until his death at just 38. The men who knew real aircraft were now drawing the plastic ones, and the difference showed. Through all of this, the founder was fading. Kove had undergone a cancer operation back in 1950, and in its aftermath, he had taken on a young assistant manager, that same Ralph Ehrman, to help carry the load. In 1957, Airfix became a public company, Airfix Industries Limited. Its shares traded on the open market. The boy from Anarchs, who had fled across half of Europe with a process for stiffening collars, now ran a quoted British company. He had little time left to enjoy it. In March 1958, 3 weeks after the death of his wife, Nicholas Kove died at his home on the Finchley Road. He had built the machine. He had never believed in the thing it was about to make. The men who did believe were now in charge. Chapter 3. The Man Who Flew and the Man Who Painted. Ralph Ehrman became chairman of Airfix in 1959, and his own story carried a particular weight given what the company was about to sell to a generation of British boys. Ehrman had been born in Leipzig in 1925. He was a German Jew, a refugee from Nazism, who had come to Britain as a child fleeing the regime that would have murdered him. And when the war came, he did not sit it out. He volunteered for the Royal Air Force and flew as a navigator and bomb aimer. The man who would build his fortune selling plastic Spitfires and Lancasters to children had ridden in the real ones over occupied Europe in the dark. He grasped 2 things his predecessor never had. The first was a matter of supply, that cheap, durable American polystyrene could be imported and moulded into kits that cost pennies and lasted years. The second was a matter of the heart. Ehrman understood that what Airfix was really selling was the chance for a boy to imagine, with his own hands, the wartime experiences of his father and his grandfather. The kit was the cheapest time machine ever built. Under Ehrman, the range exploded. It began with aircraft and ships, then spread outward in every direction a young imagination might run. Military vehicles, motorcycles, cars, including, at the spectacular end, a 1:12 scale model of a 1930 Bentley built from 272 separate parts, a kit that could occupy a serious modeler for weeks. Tiny OO and HO soldiers in their hundreds, refighting Waterloo and Arnhem across bedroom carpets, rockets and spaceships. In 1962, Airfix bought up the molds of a rival called Rosebud Kitmaster, some 35 tools in all, and acquired a whole range of model locomotives in a single stroke. And the numbers from the 1960s are worth pausing on, because they describe a national habit forming. In a single year, Airfix sold something on the order of 350,000 Spitfires, 80,000 Hurricanes, 60,000 Lancasters, not over a decade, in a year. An entire country of children was, quietly and simultaneously, assembling the Battle of Britain in plastic on 1 million kitchen tables. What sold those kits, before a single child opened one, was the art on the box. His name was Roy Cross, and he was one of the great unsung craftsmen of British childhood. A self-taught aviation illustrator, Cross began painting Airfix box art in 1964, his first commission, a Dornier Du 217, and over the following decade he produced action paintings for something like 200 kits. He did not paint the model, he painted the moment. A Lancaster limping home through flak with an engine ablaze, a Sterling bomber on a wet airfield with its bomb trolley waiting. These were not technical illustrations. They were tiny dramas, and a child standing at the Woolworths rack did not buy a box of grey plastic. He bought the story Roy Cross had painted on the front of it, and then spent the next weekend trying to build his way into it. That was the engine of the Golden Age, a refugee airman who understood the emotional pull of the product, a modeler turned designer who made the plastic accurate enough to honour the real thing, and an illustrator who turned every box into a promise. Put them together, and you had something close to a license to print money. And for once, that is very nearly what it was. But to understand the scale of what Airfix became, you have to leave the boardroom and the artist's studio and go down onto the factory floor and into the bedrooms of the nation. Chapter 4. The Smell of Polystyrene. If you grew up in Britain in the 1960s or 70s, you can almost certainly summon it now, unbidden. The smell. The sharp chemical sweetness of polystyrene cement, squeezed from a little tube, the kind that webbed across your fingertips and dried to a shiny skin you peeled off in the bath. The faint, oily scent of the sprues, the grey plastic frames the parts hung from, fresh out of the bag. The particular tang of Humbrol enamel paint, sold in those tiny tins with the colour-numbered lids, the lids that never quite sealed again once you'd levered them off with a teaspoon. For a generation of British children, that combination of smells was the smell of a Saturday afternoon. It was the smell of concentration and ambition, and the small private heartbreak of a wing that wouldn't sit, flush no matter how hard you pressed it. This was the true golden age of Airfix, and unusually for an industrial story, it lived less on the factory floor than on the kitchen table. Picture the ritual, because millions of British households knew it. The newspaper spread out to protect the table from the glue and the paint. The bag torn open, the parts tipped out, the instruction sheet unfolded and immediately misread. The careful snapping of components from the sprue, and the inevitable moment of pulling too hard and taking a chunk of the wing with it. The first sniff of the cement. The long, patient, fiddly work of a child, learning, without ever being told, the adult arts of patience and precision and the management of disappointment. Models hung from bedroom ceilings on lengths of black cotton thread, frozen mid-dogfight, fingers glued together, the lot. Behind that ritual in a building at Haldane Place, off Garrett Lane in Wandsworth, the company's home from the very beginning, the machines ran. This was the architectural heart of British boyhood, though no one ever called it that, and from the outside it looked like any other South London factory. Inside, the process had a brutal elegance. Steel tools, engineered to extraordinary tolerances, closed under enormous pressure. Molten polystyrene was injected into them. In seconds it cooled and set, and the tool opened to drop out a complete frame of parts. A whole Spitfire's worth of fuselage halves and wings, an undercarriage and tiny propeller, all hanging from their sprue, identical to the 1,000 that came before and the 1,000 that came after. The machines did not stop. They ran through the day and into the night, because the demand never let up. And the demand was the point. A toy that breaks is bought once. A construction kit is bought, built and replaced by the next kit and the next an ascending ladder of difficulty that took a child from a simple 1 to 72 fighter at the age of 7 to that monstrous 272-part Bentley at the age of 14. Airfix had, without quite intending to, designed a product that grew with its customer and never let go. The catalogue itself became an object of devotion. Children pored over it the way an older generation had pored over the Bible, memorizing kit numbers, planning campaigns of acquisition that ran years into the future. To own the Airfix catalogue was to hold the whole imaginable world in your hands. Every aircraft, every warship, every tank, ranked and numbered and priced in pocket money. Few documents have ever been studied so intently by so many people who had no intention of buying most of what was in them. By the early 1970s, Airfix was releasing as many as 17 entirely new kits in a single year. Think about what that demanded. Each new kit meant research, draftsmanship, the cutting of a new steel tool, a process of months and serious money, repeated 17 times over, year after year, while the existing range of hundreds of kits kept rolling off the machines at Haldane Place. This was not a company coasting on past success. It was a company sprinting, and it was winning a race almost no one else was even running. Chapter 5. The word for a plastic kit. There is a particular kind of victory that only a handful of companies ever achieve, and Airfix achieved it. The brand became the noun. By the mid-1970s, an Airfix kit was simply what the British called a plastic construction model, regardless of who had made it. The way a vacuum cleaner became a Hoover and a ballpoint became a biro. To say something had been built like an Airfix kit entered the language as a phrase anyone would understand. The company had not just dominated its market, it had absorbed it. The figures behind that linguistic conquest were staggering for what was, after all, a maker of children's hobby goods. At its peak in the mid-1970s, Airfix commanded around 75% of the entire British market for plastic kits and turned out something close to 20 million kits a year. 3 out of every 4 kits built in Britain carried the name. The remaining quarter was divided among everybody else. This was no longer a niche. This was a national pastime with a single dominant supplier, and the supplier was a London company that had started life making combs. The reach went further than the factory and the shop. Airfix had become woven into British popular culture in a way that money cannot buy. Eric Morecambe, one half of the most beloved comedy act in the country, built an Airfix Spitfire on the Morecambe and Wise show because building an Airfix kit was something the entire viewing nation instantly understood as an image of a man, absorbed, fiddly, content. Decades later, the broadcaster and presenter James May would assemble a full-size Spitfire out of kit parts for the BBC, an act of devotion that only made sense because the small version sat in the memory of everyone watching. The brand had become shorthand for a whole mode of British masculinity. Quiet, patient, a little obsessive, happiest at a table with a scalpel and a tube of glue and an afternoon to spare. And it had become something deeper than that, too. For a country still processing the war within living memory, Airfix offered a way of touching it that was safe and proud and shared between fathers and sons. The dad who had actually serviced the engines, or flown the sorties, or simply lived through the bombing as a boy, he could sit beside his own son, and they could build the Lancaster together, and something passed between them that neither would ever have put into words. The kits were cheap. The thing they carried was not. The company underneath all this had grown into a substantial concern. Airfix Industries Limited was now a public company of real size, headquartered at Haldane Place, with the kit business at its core and a board of directors steering it. Chairman Ralph Ehrman, the managing director David Sinigaglia, John Gray, who had run the operational boom years, and others. They had begun, sensibly enough, to spread their bets. There was an industrial plastics arm at Sunbury-on-Thames. From 1972, there was even a design-led housewares brand called Crayon, its award-winning range styled by Conran Associates and sold through Habitat. Airfix making sleek modern homewares for the very middle-class living rooms whose children built its Spitfires upstairs. From 1975, the company pushed into ready-to-run model railways, the kind you didn't have to build at all, rebranded a few years later as Great Model Railways. The empire was expanding in every direction. New kits, new ranges, new brands, new businesses. To anyone reading the trade press in the middle of the decade, Airfix looked unstoppable, A British success story in an era short of them, a company that had turned children's pocket money into a market it owned 3/4 of outright. It was, by any reasonable measure, the top of the mountain. And from the top of the mountain, you cannot always see the cliff. Chapter 6. The view from the summit. Here is the fact that makes everything that follows a tragedy rather than a simple failure. The kit business was healthy. Genuinely, robustly healthy. Right through the 1970s, the thing Airfix was famous for, the plastic kits, the Spitfires and the Lancasters and the warships, made money. It would go on making money almost to the very end. That is worth holding on to, because the story you may think you know is that Airfix somehow lost its touch, that children stopped wanting kits, that the magic faded and the company quietly died of irrelevance. None of that is true. At the moment of maximum danger, the core of Airfix was still one of the best businesses of its kind in the world. So stand for a moment where the men running Airfix stood in the early 1970s and try to see what they saw. 3/4 of the market, 20 million kits a year, a brand name that had become an English word, a devoted national following that spanned 2 generations, cash coming in, new ventures blooming on every side. They had taken a comb maker and turned it into the dominant force in an entire field, and they had every reason to believe they could do it again, in any field they chose. That belief, reasonable, evidence-based, earned through 20 years of being right, was about to become the most dangerous thing in the building. Because in the autumn of 1971, an opportunity had appeared that seemed, to confident men at the top of their game, almost too good to refuse. The greatest name in the whole history of British toy-making had just collapsed. The empire of Lines Brothers, once the largest toy manufacturer on the face of the earth, had come crashing down, and its treasures were being broken up and sold off in pieces. Among those treasures were the crown jewels themselves. Meccano, Hornby, Dinky Toys, the names that had defined British childhood for half a century, the spiritual property of Frank Hornby's great works at Binns Road in Liverpool. To the board at Haldane Place, the logic was beautiful in its simplicity. They already owned the largest range of construction kits in the world. Now they could own the most famous construction toy in the world as well, Meccano, the very thing the word construction toy conjured in the mind of every British adult. They could own Dinky. They could become, in a single stroke, the largest toy company in Britain, master of the whole field, plastic and metal alike. They were the men who had been right about everything. The kit had worked when Kove said it wouldn't. The 2-bob bag had worked. The Spitfire had worked. 17 new kits a year had worked. Crayon, the railways, the whole sprawling expansion. It was all working. Why on earth would this be the thing that didn't? Nobody inside those walls, looking out from the summit they had spent 20 years climbing, could see what they were about to walk off. The most profitable model empire Britain had ever produced was standing at its highest point, and it was about to reach down and pick up a very great weight and tie it to its own ankle. The decision would be made in London. The price would be paid in Liverpool. And the whole magnificent thing, the kits, the catalogue, the cotton thread and the kitchen tables, would follow that weight all the way down. Chapter 7. The jewel with a crack in it. To understand why the prize was poisoned, you have to understand what had already happened to it. Lines Brothers had not been some minor competitor. At its height after the war, the firm behind the Triang brand had been the largest toy maker in the entire world. And in 1964, in the kind of confident, empire-building move that the era encouraged, Lines had swallowed Meccano Limited whole, taking on Meccano itself, the Hornby Railways, and Dinky Toys in one enormous acquisition. It was meant to be a coronation. It turned out to be the beginning of a long indigestion. By the autumn of 1971, Lines Brothers had posted a record loss of some £4.5 million. A rescue deal had fallen through, and the largest toy company the world had ever seen simply came apart. Its pieces went to the winds. The railways went one way, to the group that would become Hornby Railways. Other parts went elsewhere, and the Meccano and Dinky business, Binns Road, Liverpool and everything in it, was bought by Airfix for £2,740,000. On paper, Airfix had just become the largest toy company in Britain. In reality, it had just bought a factory that was quietly bleeding. Binns Road had opened in 1914. It was the spiritual home of Frank Hornby's empire, the place where Meccano and Dinky and Hornby trains had been made for over half a century, and close to 1,000 people worked there. But it was an aging plant with high labour costs and a product line that was being slowly annihilated by competitors who had read the future more clearly than it had. Consider what had happened to Dinky alone. Dinky had more or less invented the British die-cast model car back in 1934, and for 2 decades it had ruled. Then, one by one, the rivals arrived, and each one took a bite. In 1953 came Lesnie's Matchbox, models small enough and cheap enough to be true pocket money impulse buys, sold from a box the size of a matchbox. In 1956 came Corgi, the ones with windows with their clear plastic glazing, and, before long, their James Bond Aston Martin with the ejector seat that every child in Britain wanted. And in 1968 came the Americans, Mattel's Hot Wheels, with low-friction axles that made them faster than anything Dinky had ever made. Dinky's response was cautious, expensive, and slow. Its models stayed pricey, its quality slipped as it tried to cut costs to compete, and it lost ground every single year. By the time Airfix bought it, Dinky was not a crown jewel. It was a structurally declining asset wearing the crown of one. So this was the thing Airfix had so badly wanted to own. A famous name, a beloved name, attached to an old factory with high costs, making products that newer, hungrier, cleverer rivals were beating in the market month after month. The men at Haldane Place had bought the past and paid for it as though it were the future, and almost as soon as the ink was dry, the wider world began to turn against them. In 1973, the first oil shock struck. The price of crude quadrupled, from around $3 a barrel to around $12. For most industries, this was a blow. For Airfix, it was something closer to a body blow because polystyrene, the very substance of every kit it made, is made from petroleum. The raw material of the entire business had just become dramatically more expensive, and the cost could not simply be passed on to children counting out their pocket money at the Woolworths counter. The first casualty was something beautiful. Roy Cross, the man whose burning Lancasters and rain-soaked Stirlings had sold a generation of kits, saw his commissions dry up in 1974. The oil crisis had driven up plastic costs and depressed the business, and the budget for the most distinctive box art in the industry was among the first things to go. The paintings that had promised children a story now cost more than the company felt it could justify. A small thing, perhaps, against millions of pounds. But it was the first light going out. The clouds were gathering, and the heaviest of them had a name and an address in Liverpool. Chapter 8. Good money after old names. The decisions that killed Airfix were not, for the most part, decisions to do something reckless. They were decisions to be loyal, to keep faith with a famous name, to refuse to let Frank Hornby's factory die on their watch. That is what makes them tragic, rather than merely foolish. The men at Haldane Place kept making the decent choice, and the decent choice kept costing them everything. The first and gravest decision had already been made, to buy Meccano at all. But the decisions that followed were arguably worse, because by then the evidence was mounting, and they made them anyway. Having bought a loss-making factory, Airfix chose, again and again, to pour money into trying to save it. The numbers tell the story with a brutal clarity, and they come not from speculation, but from the mouths of the men who lived it. When the end finally came for Binns Road, the factory's managing director, Ray McNeice, laid out the damage in plain figures. £5 million of losses over the previous 3.5 years, and £1 million in the current financial year alone. In the House of Commons, the Under-Secretary David Mitchell would confirm to Parliament that Meccano had been losing money since 1974, running recently at more than £1 million a year. £1 million a year in the money of the late 1970s, hemorrhaging out of a single subsidiary year after year, and Airfix kept feeding it. In February 1978, the company put together an offer of £787,000 to modernise Binns Road and preserve the jobs there, and the first tranche of it, £210,000, was actually paid over. The government was drawn in too, public money joining private in the effort to keep the old works alive. By one careful reckoning, the total sum poured into trying to save Meccano came to around £7 million. £7 million, pumped into an ageing Liverpool factory making products that Matchbox and Corgi and Hot Wheels were beating in the shops. and every pound of it had to come from somewhere, and where it came from, ultimately, was the healthy body of the company. The profitable plastic kit division, the thing that actually worked, was being slowly drained to keep the failing acquisition breathing. The financial interdependency of the whole sprawling group meant that the losses in one part poisoned the whole. The concrete weight was tied to the ankle, and it was pulling everything down with it. Ralph Ehrman tried, by all accounts, desperately to modernize the image of Meccano, to drag Frank Hornby's metal strips and brass nuts into a world of Star Wars and silicon chips. It came to little. You cannot rebrand your way out of the simple fact that children had stopped wanting the thing you make, because that was the other front in the war, and it was being lost too. The children were leaving. In 1977, a film called Star Wars arrived in Britain, and the playground was never the same again. The toys that mattered now were the licensed figures from a galaxy far, far away, and the British license for them belonged not to Airfix, but to its rival, Palitoy. Action Man was pulling boys toward play that needed no patience and no glue, and in 1978, into the nation's pubs and chip shops and seaside arcades came a machine that made a strange electronic heartbeat and ate 10-pence pieces by the bucketful: Space Invaders. The first great wave of video games had broken over Britain, and a generation that might once have spent a wet Saturday building a Lancaster now spent it feeding coins into a cabinet. And then, at the worst possible moment, came the final external blow, and this one came from the City and Westminster, not from any shop floor. Around the turn of the decade, the pound surged. Sterling climbed from around $1.56 to around $2.35 in a matter of months. For an ordinary citizen, this might have sounded like good news, a strong pound, a point of national pride. For an exporter, it was a catastrophe. Airfix sold its kits all over the world, and overnight, to a buyer in America or Europe, those kits had become something like 50% more expensive. The export markets that had helped sustain the business simply balked and went quiet. A company already bleeding from its Liverpool wound now found one of its healthiest arteries clamped shut by the strength of its own currency. Oil up, children gone, the pound strangling exports, and all the while £1 million a year disappearing into Binns Road. Any one of these the old Airfix might have weathered. Together, and with the Meccano weight already dragging, they were too much. The men at Haldane Place had wanted to own all of British toy-making. What they had actually done was lash their thriving business to a dying one. At the precise moment, the tide turned against them both, and now the bill was about to come due, first, and most cruelly, in Liverpool. Chapter 9. 20 minutes notice. Friday, the 30th of November, 1979. Binns Road, Liverpool. It was the afternoon. The shift was working, and at 10 minutes past 4, management called the workforce together in the canteen. What they were told took less time than a tea break. The factory was closing. Not in a month. Not at the end of the week. It was closing for good at 4:30 that same afternoon. They were being given, by most accounts, around 20 minutes notice that 65 years of Liverpool toy-making were over. Around 950 people were in that building. Mothers and fathers. Men and women who had given Binns Road their working lives. Some of them their fathers' working lives before them. They had walked in that morning with a job. They would walk out that afternoon without one, with barely time to fetch their coats. The managing director, Ray McNeice, did not dress it up. "We have run out of money," he said. "It's as simple as that. We had hoped for more money from Airfix, but we knew at about 3 o'clock yesterday that we weren't going to get it. We knew yesterday at 3 o'clock, and they told the workforce the following afternoon, with 20 minutes to spare." One of the foremen, a man remembered only as Albert, whose letters survived through a local historian, wrote that very night. The factory had been gathered in the canteen at 4:10, he set down, and told it was closing for good at 4:30. 20 minutes notice, all 900 of the workforce. Some, he wrote, were sitting in all weekend as a protest. They were, and the protest did not last a weekend. It lasted 14 weeks. The workers occupied the plant. Many of them were women, and they were not going quietly. The closure had been so abrupt, so brutal in its execution, that it became a scandal that reached all the way to Parliament. The members for Liverpool stood up in the Commons. David Alton raised it. Eric Ogden raised it, and he did not mince his words. He called it an action of almost incredible ineptitude and bad judgment, the closure at less than 1 hour's notice of the Meccano factory at Binns Road. He revealed something uglier still, that workers' letters had been intercepted by management. There was a legal dimension too. The company had failed to give the statutory 90 days notice that the law required. The matter was serious enough that even the Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, warned that Airfix could face prosecution over it. And through it all, the occupation held. Through the back end of 1979 and into the bitter early weeks of 1980, the workers stayed inside Frank Hornby's old factory and refused to leave. When management cut the power on Christmas Eve, the workers brought in their own heaters and ran a generator, and they stayed. They marched, too. The Save Meccano campaign put 1,000 people onto the streets of Liverpool, walking to the pierhead alongside steelworkers from Shotton and tractormen from Massey Ferguson, all of them facing the same cold arithmetic in the same hard winter. It ended, as these things so often did, with bailiffs and police. On the 11th of March, 1980, bailiffs and some 30 policemen forced their way into the Binns road site, and the 14-week protest was over. By then, around 700 of the workers had accepted redundancy. The occupation had won them dignity and time and a place in the historical record. It had not won them their factory. Binns Road fell silent. The machines that had stamped out dinky cars and Meccano sets since before the First World War stopped, and the silence that came down over that great Liverpool works was the wrong shape. A silence in a place built for noise, for the clang of metal and the voices of 1,000 people and the rhythm of a working day that had run for 65 years and would now never run again. The decision had been made in a boardroom in London. The price had been paid, in full, in Liverpool. But the weight that had dragged Binns Road down was still tied to Airfix itself, and within a year it would pull the whole company under too. Chapter 10. The Receiver Calls. Through 1980, the position grew hopeless. The Meccano disaster had done its work, and the wider storm, the oil costs, the strangled exports, the children drifting towards screens and licensed figures, gave the company no shelter and no time to recover. The banks moved first. In 1980, Airfix was forced by its bankers to sell off its two most profitable businesses simply to satisfy them. A desperate measure, the corporate equivalent of selling the furniture to pay the rent. A company tearing off its own healthy limbs to stay alive a little longer is not a company that is going to survive. It is a company being taken apart while it still breathes. And then, in January 1981, the end came. Airfix Industries called in the receiver. There is a terrible irony in the timing and the setting. It was at the Earl's Court Toy Fair, the great annual gathering of the British toy trade, the shop window of the whole industry, that the company announced it would cease to trade. At the very fair where Airfix had once arrived as the largest toy company in Britain, master of plastic and metal alike, it now arrived to announce its own death. The crown jewels of British toy-making, gathered up so confidently a decade before, were now part of an estate to be sold off by men with no interest in toys at all. The plastic kit division, the thing that had always worked, the thing that was still, even now, fundamentally sound, went under the hammer along with everything else. A healthy business, killed not by its own failings, but by what had been chained to it. What followed was the scattering, the kit business itself, along with the great model railways range, and, in a final twist of the knife, Meccano and Dinky too, was bought by an American giant, the food and toy conglomerate General Mills, and placed under its British arm, Palitoy. There was a bitter symmetry in that. Palitoy held the British Star Wars license, the very thing that had helped pull children away from Airfix in the first place. The company that had been wounded by the future was now owned by the company holding the future's license. The kit moulds, those precious steel tools, each one representing months of skilled work and decades of accumulated craft, were packed up and shipped across the Channel to a General Mills factory at Calais in France. The most English of products, the plastic Spitfire, would now be moulded on the wrong side of the water. The profitable plastics and foam side of the old empire, the industrial mouldings and the crayon housewares, went a different way, sold to a Midlands group, McKechnie Brothers, in a deal worth £47 million. That figure, set beside the wreckage of the toy business, tells its own quiet story about which parts of the old Airfix had real value and which had been the millstone all along. And so the great enterprise that Nicholas Kove had begun with combs and belt buckles that Ralph Ehrman had built into a national institution was broken into pieces and parcelled out. The name survived. The company did not. The tooling now began a long exile that would become the stuff of legend. And, as legends do, the story grew taller in the telling. Chapter 11. The Long Way Home. There is a romantic story, told and retold among collectors, that the legendary Airfix tooling was scattered across the globe, and much of it lost forever. Moulds gone missing, tools vanished at sea, the irreplaceable craft of decades simply disappeared. It is a good story. It is also, mostly, a myth, though, like most myths, it has a hard kernel of truth at its centre. The tools did travel a long and undignified road. From Calais, when General Mills got out of the toy business altogether in 1986, Airfix passed to the Hobby Products Group of Borden, the American firm that already owned Humbrol, the very enamel paint that generations of children had brushed onto their kits. The moulds moved again, from Calais down to a factory at Troon, in France, run by a company called Hella. Then, in 1994, ownership passed to Irish investors. The kits soldiered on, reissued and rebranded, sold under one name and then another, the old tools growing older and more travelled with each change of hands. And then, in 2006, the music nearly stopped for good. Hella collapsed. Humbrol collapsed. The whole structure that had carried Airfix through its long exile fell apart at once, and for a moment it looked as though the name itself might finally die. It did not, because at that moment an old rival stepped in, and there was a kind of homecoming in it. Hornby, the very name from Binns Road, the railway company born out of Frank Hornby's empire, now a thriving British concern in its own right, bought Airfix and Humbrol together for £2,600,000, and Hornby did something that mattered enormously to everyone who had ever loved the brand. It brought the tooling home. A man named Trevor Snowden was sent to Trun to find the tools, identify them, and recover them, and what he found gave the lie to the gloomiest version of the legend. The old catalogue, it turned out, was pretty much complete. The romantic tragedy of tooling lost at sea and scattered beyond recovery was, in the main, just that, romance. Most of it had survived its long journey and could come back to Britain. Not all of it. There were genuine losses, and they sting. The great 1 to 600 scale mould for the liner SS France went missing somewhere along the way. A handful of car tools, the Austin Maxi, the Morris Marina, the strange little Bond bug, were ruined, left to spoil in open storage during one of the moves to France, treated as scrap rather than the heirlooms they were. Those are gone, and a small part of the catalogue went with them, but the heart of it survived. The Spitfires and the Lancasters, the warships and the soldiers, the great accumulated body of British modelling. Most of it came home in the end, packed into lorries and brought back across the Channel to the country that had made it. The tooling, at least, got its homecoming. The factories did not. Chapter 12. What Remains. Go to Binns Road in Liverpool today, and there is nothing to find. The great works where Frank Hornby built his empire, where Meccano and Dinky were made for 65 years, where 950 people were given 20 minutes' notice on a Friday afternoon in 1979. Most of it was gone by the end of 1980, demolished and the site cleared. The last building came down at the end of the 80s. What stands there now is a car park, part of an industrial estate, with no plaque, no marker, nothing at all to tell a passer-by what once happened on that ground. Collectors still make the pilgrimage. They describe arriving at a place where, as one of them put it, nothing remains. In Wandsworth, the story is gentler, but no less strange. The building at Haldane Place still stands, the architectural heart of British boyhood, where the kits were moulded from the beginning. But it is a business centre now, in an Earlsfield so thoroughly gentrified that the area has earned the nickname Nappy Valley, full of young professional families. The old factory has been tidied up and rebranded, and somewhere in its name, the word Airfix survives as a kind of ghost. The later Airfix and Humbrol factory up in Hull came down in 2008. The physical places, one by one, have been erased or repurposed almost beyond recognition. And yet, and here is where this story parts company, with almost every other tale of British industrial loss, the thing itself did not die. Walk into a model shop in Britain today, and you will find Airfix kits on the shelf. Real ones. New ones. Under Hornby, the brand has not merely survived but revived, reissuing the great classics as vintage classics, complete with the original Roy Cross paintings on the boxes, those same burning Lancasters and rain-soaked airfields that sold the kits the first time around. And it is tooling brand new kits at a rate not seen since the glory days of the 60s and 70s. The Spitfire is still being moulded. A child in Britain today can still buy one, still spread the newspaper on the kitchen table, still smell the polystyrene cement and the humbrel enamel, still glue their fingers together, learning the old arts of patience and care. So what do we make of it? In the end, this empire built on 2 Bob Spitfires, sunk by the famous name it could not resist owning. The temptation is to call it a simple tale of one fatal mistake, and there is real truth in that. The Meccano acquisition was the concrete weight. Beyond any doubt, £5 million of losses in 3.5 years, £7 million poured into a hole that could not be filled, a healthy company drained dry to keep a dying name alive. Had Airfix never reached for Binns Road, it might be reaching for the shelf in your local model shop today under its own steam. But the fuller truth is sadder and more human than a single error. Airfix was not destroyed by one act of folly. It was destroyed by loyalty to a famous name. At the very moment the oil price turned, and the pound turned, and the children turned away towards screens and films and licensed plastic figures, it was killed by the decent instinct not to let Frank Hornby's factory die. An instinct that took the most profitable model empire Britain ever produced and tied it to the bottom of the sea. The men who made the decision did not set out to destroy anything. They were the men who had been right about everything, trying to be right one more time. That is how these things usually happen. Not through villainy, through confidence and loyalty, and reasonable decisions made by people who could not see the cliff from the summit. The factories are gone. The car park sits where the canteen stood, but the Spitfire on the bedroom shelf hung from its length of black cotton thread that survived all of it. And on a kitchen table somewhere in Britain tonight, a child is opening a bag of grey plastic parts and beginning, without knowing it, to keep something alive.